So that doesn't mean I made a light presentation, but what I did during this day was to actually adapt a little bit to what I've heard before. So I will try not to rehash what has been addressed, but rather put some kind of perspective. So let's see how it lands. So I have a tendency to speak faster and faster, so if some of you feel that it's too fast, just hand over and slow down. So what I'm going to try to do is I think not to go through yet so many new tools, but rather to put some kind of, from my perspective, in terms of faculty at KI, what I would think a faculty would be interested in hearing in connection to what you've heard. So simulation, still, whatever you say, still, this is simulation from the medical community, faculty. This is how they perceive simulation. Mannequins, or what we call power task trainers, when you test a specific procedure. It can be testing, communication skills, team training. This is the core of simulation. A lot of new buildings, people invest money in creating buildings with simulation centers. This is still what I believe is the core of the still medical simulation. My name is Nabi Zari. My field is medical simulation. I'm from a quite exciting department that actually combines the learning, the informatics, management, and ethics, which means that this has an impact on the kind of research we do when we try to combine different aspects. So it's about technology, about learning, about how to implement this in the curriculum. Karolinska, I show this because it has actually an impact on the way we think and how things progress. It's a campus very distributed all over Stockholm. And you see I'm usually here somewhere, and my office is here. But everything else, all the training, education is based in a big South campus and at different hospitals. So it's not one single campus. Also, another point I want to make is how I perceive medical education is not only for physicians. Okay, so at KI there are 22 different programs, all within health. So for us, medical education is physicians, nurses, physiotherapists. It's also patient education. So we are not narrowed in terms of medicine as being only for physicians, and it has an impact on first the way we perceive the activities we create, but also the activities between these two. Interprofessional education is quite big at KI. So what are the commonalities based on the previous, I cannot kind of ignore what has been said before, so I try to start from there and say that actually everything I heard is about learning somehow, some learning. And if I try to split into what I've heard, the different products or presentations, they aim at different stakeholders, maybe students or faculty or patients. They all try to fit into one or several of those, either skills, knowledge, and attitudes. And that's very important to remember. That's the underlying outcome we try to address. It's skills, knowledge, attitudes, or one of them, or several of them. And I'm just actually picking up things that are in our medical program is what knowledge is about, medical knowledge. Then what the yellow squares then become different based on the stakeholder. In my presentation, I try to keep one, but then it could be any kind. In my presentation, I keep the track of someone studying medicine or specialist or is out there in some kind of lifelong learning development. So in this sense, knowledge is medical knowledge with the focus mostly on understanding both the pathophysiology, but also the terminologies and everything. The skills, and it's not only the technical skills you see very often in simulation, they try in surgery and everything, but it's also the scientific thinking, the ability to communicate. What we have also as assessment is the ability to know where you are in your development, your awareness, what do you know, what you don't know. And finally, attitudes, and you've heard these terms coming during the whole conference, is your values and attitudes toward others, other peers in your work, patients, families, and everything. So so this is my stand, it evolves around this perspective. Now the next thing is there are different models of how to get some kind of nice view on what you try to achieve, but in medicine, we are very much toward competencies. And competencies, this is a model, it's still used very widely, but there are other, but this one is a good one, because it has different levels. First, in terms of levels of expertise or what you want to achieve, you know how, show how, and in the field of simulation, this is very common. Then on this side, you see it comes back to the knowledge, skills, attitudes. There are dimensions of this. And then there's the idea that you develop towards some kind of expert level tool. And then on the left side, you see we talked about behavior and cognition, but here it's more subtly toward if you were a faculty and you're doing something, planning for your course, this is probably some of the elements you would try to center your learning activity around. So here gives it's maybe fact, knowledge, and the ability to understand it, apply it, and then the ability to show that you actually have acquired this. And it goes toward performance in practice. You're out there and and then under it, you find examples currently of learning activities that are being used. So let's say you find very often multiple choice questions, essay, and then you go toward more like simulation. This is more practical settings, and then you are in the workplace where you're more learning in this real setting. So this is Miller's pyramid. That's very often based in how people think when they think about competency in simulation, but also it's also keeps this area, this learning aspect. Then what it means in practice is following: is if you are buying into this, and there are different models, you will always end up with trying to think in our context, serious gaming. I think the question you want to ask is, how does it fit in a curriculum, or as a teacher, you already have a curriculum most often. So how does it fit? This is how we do at KI. We try to map the competencies. I won't go into detail, but just to do visual, very visual, map the whole curriculum and competencies. And then sometimes we end up say, oh, in this area, we currently don't have good activities or good ways of supporting this. So you start from the outcome, you start from the learning. And then when you find, this is what we call not in balance, you can call it. But then when you've identified an area there is room for improvement, then you start to list ways of improving that. So in our case, this is another example. For example, in terms of behavior, there is a lack somewhere, and then you think, how should I do it? What I'm trying to say is that I would urge the community, when they start to adopt use gaming or applied gaming, may do, as from the faculty side, doing some kind of similar exercise. Say, I'm getting this, what's the underlying thinking behind it? How does it fit into my current curriculum? It makes life much easier. So we've heard online, but I recently took some photos of how computer-based simulation is used. Of course it's online, and you heard the discussion about should we go to the students, should the students come to us? But if you go back to very traditional campuses at the moment, the bulk of this kind of tools are used. I don't mean it's proper use, but still the teacher is still in this context, and this is increasing interactivity. Sometimes this is free, you have a tutor showing up and help you out, or you have a group. This is a PBL setting when you use the technology, or they work in collaboratively solving problems and things. So this is the last one, is that beside trying to have an awareness of the curriculum, how it's structured, and how this fits, because it's easier to communicate and easier to look for literature to support it. There's another thing that is very important is what kind of dots are you trying to move? So in that case, this is just an example of one university, it's not KI, is that you do a mapping of your current pedagogical model. I don't put any positive, negative into it. You just map it. What are the underlying? Is it teacher-centered? Most of the activities require teacher to be there to happen. Is it most based on people are supposed to get a lot of information through their lectures? That's what or it's around disciplines, or it happens mostly at hospitals, university hospitals. It's very structured. It's opportunities you show up. And then you create what you really want to achieve in terms of development in your curriculum. That's where you want to go. And then looking at applied gaming or any kind of simulation, you see what is the expected improvement when you enter. You become more student-centered, for example, your activity. So you need to do some kind of mapping too in terms of what are you trying to move. Because my experience, otherwise, it's very hard to understand what you're trying to do. Are you just putting in tools, isolated tools in courses, and then it's very much based on the faculty being very aware of the tools, but then when the faculty leaves or there is a new, it's very hard to keep this sustained. It disappears with the person that happens to like it or is well knowledgeable. By having this structured way of doing it, things will stay and improve. The modalities is that here, when I look at Segamed conference, there's over an emphasis on computer-based tools. So that's why I'm going to show how does this translate in my world. So learning with simulations, if you look at literature, it's mostly like you learn to think like a healthcare personnel act. So these the both aspects. And these are the four that keeps coming back, is the ability to support you reflect on your practice, you create new patterns of information, that's learning. A lot of things are around mistakes. You try either to avoid mistakes or learn from mistakes. And what you've heard about surgery, the whole idea is to train until you're really good enough before you actually encounter real patients. But this is, you cannot see that this is light blue, so it doesn't translate well. But this is another way of grasping this area we've been talking about is, no, this is blue. Think of this as a nice color, not this one. Let's say think of this as red or something. There are four areas, I think, that are, this is exciting because you cannot read it, so I'll read it for you. There are four areas, actually, if you want to map everything you heard, and then try to see how does different tools fit in simulation. There is actually this one here is the above part is you try to create simulation that can happen in a real setting, be it a university or hospital. So you don't try to move away from a real context, but you provide simulation where you are. This one is called augmented reality, and I will show you just an example. Is you actually have something ongoing in your practice, and you use simulation to augment it. I'll show you an example for. And then this one on the right is very much, it's called life logging, and I think it's big, is because why don't you use the experiences from patients through blogs, use them as education activities in your, and that's also simulation. This is an example of augmented reality. This is a real patient foot, and then you get the additional information from their X-ray healthcare records. So suddenly, not only you are in the real practice, you see the real patient, but also you get additional computer-generated information. So you can go through again anatomy and pathophysiology. It's very powerful, and it's a very growing field. Next, this is where I struggle the most. Where I struggle the most is this part. Because this part is more simulation, where mirror words is where the bulk of the simulation is today, is this you recreate real activities in a simulated world. That's what mirror world. While virtual world, for me, that's where the serious gaming, applied gaming ends. It's somewhere here. It's you don't have to comply with the reality, but you optimize the environment for the learning. It's very powerful in terms of learning. So I'll start with the virtual worlds, and this is an example of it, is that you are in an environment where you train you act as a healthcare staff, and you go through different procedure. I show you in detail a very concrete example how we use it. This is something from you guys, from Segamed, where you have gaming aspects or gamification aspects, but the whole idea is quite similar. So 2 stories. The first story is that's the last thing. When I hear this community talk, and I'm part of it, is that it seems like this can learn from previous experiences of similar communities that have passed this beyond. So what I've heard now is there's a need to do research, there's a need to have a larger community, they need to have increased collaboration among different stakeholders, not being fragmented. This happened exactly the same thing for another example I will show you again. So just to inspire you, I show you how this community has evolved. And some said, now we have a good product. The next step is to provide some kind of authoring tool to be able to give this over to the end users to create. So this is the same thing I've heard before. Just it happened to another area. And the thing is, mirror world is the big area. So I'm going to use it as an example because for me it's almost implementation ready. It's used a lot. If you remember when I showed this in a different way, is that I showed you that you need to map the different kind of simulations to what you try to achieve. This is an example of it, is that you can end up saying for the core knowledge, I'll just have lectures, basic stuff, and virtual patients for maybe clinical reasoning, and then I use maybe standardized patients, which are often real patients. I use them for counseling skills, communication, and as I go to use the mannequins to have the team training, the lower the risk, patient safety, and of course the real patient is still there. It's also a simulation. It's the end point of simulation for hands-on patient care. So it doesn't disappear. But what you do is you try to fit this to the different modalities to some kind of, I keep coming back to continuum of competency. So I see all of them fit, and all new technology will always fit. The question is, where does it fit? So this is just an example of the far left. It can be just like a ECG, electrocardiogram, that becomes the lowest level of computer-based information you provide with the case around it. So this is an example that I got inspired when I was hearing this about serious gaming and applied gaming, and probably there are many names. The same thing happened to virtual patients, exactly the same, which is virtual patients until today can be defined in 4 different ways. It can be a medical record of a real patient, so every time a real patient goes to the clinic, an additional record is created. So actually, a computer-based version of this record is a virtual patient. It could be a simulation of, for the engineers, a lot of models are being created in engineer science. A simulation using some kind of dynamic simulation using patient data is also a virtual patient. And then more into the recent ones, the simulation of real life, of clinical scenarios. Scenario-based learning is big, is when you act as a health professional. And what you do here is you obtain history. This is more clinical reasoning, physical exam, and you provide the diagnosis and therapy. And then the last one is also a clinical scenario, but then it's more inclusive because then it's any kind of, its purpose is healthcare and medical training. So this one is more medicine, physician. This one is all the healthcare personnel. So different definitions. When you still look up in the literature, you find sometimes if you're not aware about this, you can say, is this really a virtual patient or not? So those are the definitions that has been solidified. A virtual patient can be quite simple, and this is let's say someone that has not been using computer-based learning before can maybe start this way. Simple case. You introduce to the case. This is Claudine. She's 61. But you probably have this kind of case on paper, and then you do a physical exam, and then you do a review of systems, you order lab, you get lab answers, you order some imaging, and then some x-rays, or and then mammogram, and then you provide some diagnosis and therapy. And you get some feedback too, in terms of what was the correct way of diagnosing everything. And then, even at this level, there are gamification elements. So you can get scores, how good is the performance, you can get time, and also the costs. How much was your activity, how much did it cost? But still again, it's the whole virtual patient I showed you has a theoretical anchoring. So it's based on the clinical reasoning aspects. So what I'm trying to say now is, what I have heard very often is, what is new is the way you present information, is the features or the mechanics of it. But if you take steps back, you come back to the same learning theories, and very often you have this element, even if they're not exposed, of reasoning that are established. The other aspect is the authoring. Same thing, virtual patient community is now in the stage where it's not a technology-centric activity. Any teacher can create cases, and it's very easy to author. A teacher can pretty much do it the day before the lecture, which is usually the case, and put it online. Put it on a mobile, just name it, all thing. What happened is, when you reach this phase in terms of virtual patients, then we had this that happens now already in the serious gaming, explosion of different products. Okay, a lot. Think about the faculty, how hard it is to go out and shop. But if you do dissection of this, you end up that a lot of them are structured the same way. You can have a case that progresses like a PowerPoint slide, like I'm doing now, or you can have a case that is very much branched. You make decisions. So once again, the representation is very rich, different ways of representing, but the underlying models very often is the same, with modifications. The second example is this one that is at the nearest. How much time do you have left? 5? Okay. The nearest I can find what I've seen is this one. Is actually what we do at KI is that someone had an idea of what is the business model. Our business model, when it becomes too techy, is that we actually always would like to work with companies. But what we do is we send them a specification of what we want. So everything I told you before is sent to the company. So we never just take something from a company, but rather help them be aware of what is important to us. And I think when I talk to a few companies here, that's what they expect. Expect not just someone shopping a product, but rather come, this is what we want to achieve, blah, 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 etc. And this is actually created by the outspin of a Stanford company, and we use it in production, where you can log in, you can choose to be a physician or nurse or physiotherapist, and when you enter, you have an environment where the whole idea is for you to function in a clinical environment. So this is also a virtual patient, but you also have a patient record, you can sedate him or her, you can take medication, you can wash your hands. So you can get a more complex environment where you can learn, teach, but also assess the people's. That's the nearest practice you can come in a computer-based environment, from my perspective. But once again, this environment is not built just this way. This environment is built on something called, if you've heard of it in the US, Institute for Healthcare Improvements. So it's built on well-validated processes, where in this case it's a sepsis case. You have elements that are important to have in a sepsis case. You have the cost. Why isn't this procedure important? Because if you comply with this, it will be timely, most effective. So this was the underlying blueprint for this environment. So you can think of, if you have this as an underlying model, then you can create different representations. What I show you is just one of them. It could evolve, and you can add gamification. It can become a game, but the underlying model and thinking is traceable and not technology-oriented. Same thing happened there. even though it's 3D environment. They have an authoring tool, and that authoring tool, you can pretty much change everything, the type of scenario, what object you can see in the room, if you enter, if the bed is 0 degrees, so you can create different kind of scenario, and that's something the faculty does. So you can change pretty much everything here without the assistance of a technology. Now comes the where we are in terms of virtual patients, is that what happens now is what I've showed you before is pre-prepared scenarios. Either they have different kind of designs, and you can change the activity by itself. But here what comes now is you actually can generate virtual patient directly from guidelines, clinical guidelines. And these are, I know it's hard to read, but you can either use guidelines to generate a virtual patient activity. You can use it maybe to provide feedback. So when you run, it checks the guidelines, it gives you feedback based on what you're doing. But also it could be like an element in the virtual patient, because in the field of clinical guidelines, the problem is compliance, is people following these guidelines. Finally, the last one is that actually why generate new, why as a faculty, why generate new cases if you can get it from patient health record? So this is another research project that actually, Nabil, I'm a patient with a heart disease. If I'm given my authorization, I can provide ways of anonymizing Nabil. Nabil becomes someone else, and automatically I have a virtual patient me that is used in education. So as next time I come back, the virtual patient evolves, and it's a perfect match to reality. That's actually happening. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so thank you for having designed such a precise landscape and giving us those many elements. Some questions perhaps in the audience?
Yes, thank you very much. I have zillion of questions, so I can ask questions until the end, but I will hopefully can ask 3. One of the aspects a doctor is allowed to do, is changing the path of the protocol, argumented. Because that's only a doctor is allowed to do that. So how do you cope with that? Because you're strictly following rules, you're strictly following systems, etc. Yeah. But learning is basically learning from differentiations in the variations in the protocol. Yeah. How do you build that into that system?
Yeah. I left out a lot of things from there, but of course, if you think about pedagogics, learning can be done different ways. So there are different ways. So what you proposing is learning through variations. So until now, it has been done by a large library of virtual patients. So what happens is, based on your performance on the virtual patient, you provided maybe a harder case or easy case. So let's say you could end up with 10 diabetes cases. And then the idea is you learn the difference between different factors, maybe older patient, younger patient, everything. But then there is this is a very important thing is, this area is going several routes. One is maybe what I've shown in terms of the simpler VPs are appropriate for maybe the beginning of undergrad. If undergrad is first 2 years, 3 years, all curriculum in dependent countries are still based on the Flexner report. So it's a very preclinical and transitional years, and then a clinical. So this could be the beginning. So where the idea is to able to collect information, able to interpret. As you go, then actually the virtual patients change completely shape and become more around patient management. So the routes are different, so you can end up killing the patient, or you can end up, so you have this aspect of branching. But also, you have elements like I showed you, immersive, when the whole thing is not reasoning, but it's communication between the teams or aspects. And then lastly, what's happening now is that there is a large consortium in Europe called the Virtual Physiological Human. So they have a large library of, so this allows to create dynamic virtual patients. So what you get, that's why I was pinpointing our representation is what is new. So this will enable, when you interact with the virtual patient, it's not predefined. it will react to what you do, and it will have a progress. But the progress is defined on libraries of physiological, I know it's still research, but that's where we aim in. So what I see is that all these domains are merging, and what the difference will be is how you present. So what I would like to see in the future is a common data model that is using everything you have, and then you optimize the output. One output could be apply game. One could be a simple VP. A third one could be actually you push in data to mannequin instead of just having someone prepare a scenario. I think that's why I would like to push toward and having, so then there is room for all the modalities. The question is to find where they are best, what they're best for. That's why I'm very happy about this serious gaming thing, because it's missing. There's a missing part, and no one is driving it. So my proposal is find the easy way to get people go in and don't feel like this is a completely different community.
Maybe we can have a new concept of serious cases for clinical games. No? Serious cases for clinical games.
Yeah, I think you're laughing, but actually, if you think about the cases are, that's exactly you can. If we, I think at this stage I showed you the same thing is happening in different domains, and they don't talk to each other. So if we pull the resources and put on the right level, because clearly the competency around designing games is a specific competency, and it's not a faculty level competency. So, but then what can the other stakeholders provide so it can be used by several communities? Otherwise, I see again the same thing happening, and I have a hard time thinking that a big research community will focus only on serious games. But if you go back and think, this is all about learning, it's about designing different activities for different competencies, and this new field is very important, then you get to opt in for the current community in terms of what, and then it's up to us to define what is missing to
in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, in Radboud University, there is they have a game around geriatrics,
yeah.
And they learn about, of course, medical ethics,
Yeah.
useful treatments, but also cost, and also listen to the patient.
Yeah.
And the outcome of the game is a report, which is discussed around the table with the doctors as if it was a real patient.
That's very good.
I think
Yeah.
these are kind of games or things you're looking at, but I'm not
Yeah, I
sure.
think, and you win what what I learned from, what I think the gaming would be excellent is it's so engaging that people will keep trying. I said you expand, they spend more time on it. So I think that's very valuable in terms of if it's engaging, it's fun, it's learning there is there, but it's implicit in terms. And then you follow up with good activities. As a faculty, I would think, what is the follow-up? What kind of feedback am I giving? How do I integrate this? That's why I started with actually the endpoint, which is the implementation part of it. And if you get a structure there, I think this will clearly be, but right now, my feeling is that there's a gap, and you can have the best design and the best faculty. How do we bridge this so it starts to be implemented? And I trust implementation research in this case is a very valuable way of getting this, but it requires implementation.
Yeah, but the representation of the game in Nijmegen is only the file, the dossier
Yeah.
patient.
Yeah.
So it's
But in our case, that would be typical virtual patient. You just call it.
Thank you very much for the very nice overview. Coming back to kind of a library of cases that could potentially go into different modalities, I do see a lot of potentials in this, and I think there's lots of positive sides to this. I think a potential danger is that we get stuck in just replicating the reality, and that we kind of miss the opportunities that might be modality specific to go beyond what is possible in the reality. So I think but I think we also would need to help people who use it. That's part of the implementation, who use the different simulation modalities to help learners learn, that they actually also understand this. Where can they go beyond the possibilities of just recreating the patient in their respective modality?
I agree. That's why I presented the quadrants. But I focused on the mirroring world. That's why it was so specific. But actually, there are 4 different ways into this. If you remember augmented reality, you are in real context. You don't have any control over it. It's there, it's happening. So for each person, the learning activity will be different. The one coming from the patient live login, the patients themselves, with their perspective is coming in. It's not something you decide. And then finally, the virtual world, that's why you actually can design optimum environment. Does not need to mimic the real reality. That's why I started with this quadrant. But I felt it would take too much time to bring all of them and focused on the mirroring world. That's why it's so matching the reality. But that's not the intent.
Thanks. Oh. Thank you. No, Pam. Another question.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I just wanted to make a comment and maybe see if you can react to it. But I got the impression when you're talking that you weren't talking a lot about play or fun.
Yeah.
And I kind of was thinking that when I talk to doctors, a lot of times it seems like they don't want to connect fun and play with their work. There's almost like aversion to it, and then it can't be serious. You can't learn, or there's something there about like, let's not talk about play or fun. When I look at it from my perspective, and I think if it were fun, you'd probably learn more, and you'd be more likely to explore. But I think there's also the side too, because I was thinking, Yuridiana was talking about, can you make mistakes and learn that way? And in medicine, it's like, you don't want people to mess up the protocol too much, because that's at the root of errors. You don't want them playing around with all these different things, because they might start getting used to that. But so what's your impression about this whole fun?
Yeah, I think there I have a buy-in on generation, because I quite often observe, and gaming is very much part of the current generation. For example, there is 2 students that created a game which is only based on SMS. So it's no tech. So they all, because you remember, Kia, how separate, I mean, if you are a course of 200 people, after the second year, you split into 50s. So, but people keep in touch through Facebook and groups and everything, but also for the real clinical, they create clinical case. So they send challenges to each other. So that's gaming, that's fun. So the morning in the subway, she told me, I started to send the first SMS. This is a case, a challenge. And it goes round and round, and independent. So they game, and they'll have a lot of fun. The question is, how much should this be structured by faculty? I don't trust that. What I think is that you can have it implicit in your design as much as possible, but they will play and they will game. And they would like to connect it to their life, with their life. So they are doing it. I think there is a generation difference. So my belief is that you have 2 ways of working with this. Either you keep justifying against the older generation, or you just leave them go and then focus on in this case, I feel like it's happening. It's happening. And you have to know, in these professions, they're often very young. They after they end their high school, they are 20s, in their 20s. So it's what the challenge we have is lifelong learning, where people are already in profession. If you want to really create a continuum of competency, because it never ends, is how do you get to those that are there, or maybe like me, over 40, and they are going to be there until they're 67. They're the challenges. But there, no. And they create their own games, their own mobile, there are tools there. So I think that's so keep hope.
So thank you, Nabil, for this very interesting paper.